Hi, everyone. We've set up this Being an Engineer podcast as an industry knowledge repository, if you will. We hope it'll be a tool where engineers can learn about and connect with other companies, technologies, people, resources, and opportunities. So make some connections and enjoy the show.
It was an incredible experience, both from an educational standpoint, but also personally, right? I got to see changes happen in my brother that I was partially responsible for.
Hello and welcome to the Being an Engineer podcast. Our guest today is Joe Bogusky, who is a senior mechanical engineer at Intuitive Surgical and has been working in the medical device engineering field for 25 years. Joe's focus is developing innovative, minimally invasive medical devices, and he has been involved with every stage of the process from identifying the clinical need through manufacturing. Most recently, Joe's experience has been focused on engineering surgical robots, which we'll dive into in greater detail during the interview. Joe, thanks so much for being with me today.
Yeah, it's my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Okay, so what was it when you were a young lad that made you think to yourself, I want to become an engineer?
Well, I'm probably like many people. I've had a similar story and just like taking things apart and trying to put them back together, sometimes successfully, sometimes not so much. But I've been personally motivated. I have a younger brother who was born with cerebral palsy and autistic. And, I didn't feel as though that I had the capability to help him out at a neurological level. I think humans are still struggling with the ability to help autistic individuals at a neurological level. But I thought that I could help him mechanically, get around, and mobility. So I was really driven by what can I do to help individuals have a higher quality of life. And in the case of my brother, I tried to give him a better, more independence to get around on his own without always seeking help.
That's amazing. Would you be comfortable sharing any of the contraptions or tools or devices that you came up with to help your brother?
Sure. So my father was a auto mechanic at the time. So although not college educated, he was incredibly clever with coming up with devices and instruments. And we went to an institution that advocated therapy. And unfortunately, a lot of his therapeutic equipment was expensive. So mostly my dad. I'd love to take more credit than I deserve, but it was mostly my dad. I certainly would help out where possible, but we would come up with less expensive or DIY versions of those therapeutic instruments to help with whatever he needed at the time, whether it was some mobility devices or some vestibular or respiratory devices to kind of get him in a regiment of good balance, good breathing, good oxygen to the brain, or what have you.
I hope this doesn't come across as flippant at all, but what an amazing phase to go through as a young man in preparation for becoming an engineer. I mean, you can't get better experience than that and motivation to make something.
Yeah, absolutely. I really appreciate you taking the time to say that. My life was different, but it was an incredible experience, both from an educational standpoint, but also personally, right? I got to see changes happen in my brother that I was partially responsible for.
Yeah, that's amazing.
No,
thank you for sharing that. Well, you mentioned on your LinkedIn profile that you have been involved in nearly every stage of the product life cycle, including concept, prototype, laboratory, and clinical evaluation, iteration and improvement, manufacturing, marketing, packaging, sterilization. Do you have a favorite stage of the product development cycle? And if so, why?
From a product development cycle, it's got to be the prototyping development stage. Coming up with these crazy ideas and then going to the lab to try and actually put it together. It really feels like you're in the sandbox, which is great. Unfortunately, you can't spend too much time or money while you're there, so you have to be efficient with what you do. But yeah, the idea the opportunity to pull in all of these little things that you've picked up along the way, or things that you've observed, and try and implement it into what you're trying to do with one particular project. Oh yeah, that's really the most fun part of the design phase for me. So,
yeah, the early stage stuff.
Yeah, for sure. Although I got to say, I actually enjoy the opportunity to witness some idea that I was so confident about, it was definitely going to work, and see it fail. But more precisely, seeing how it would fail, so I could at least learn something, right? Nobody likes to be wrong. However, if you're wrong with the opportunity to learn something, that's really worthwhile.
Absolutely, absolutely. I'm putting you on the spot a little bit here, but can you think of a particular situation where you prototyped something and it did not turn out the way you expected it to, and maybe what did you learn from that?
Yeah, sure. So, let me think about that for 1 second. I would have to say that early on in my career, I was just learning a little bit more about materials, and I made catheters for a significant portion of my career, and those catheters typically have a PTFE liner, that's polytetrafluoroethylene or Teflon, and it's a lubricious, which means it's slick material, and it's decently robust. But the device that I was working on, we were making it in such a way that it was subjected to a great deal of stresses. And the thought was, well, let's just make the PTFE thicker, and that would be more resilient. And it turns out, because of the way PTFE is manufactured, making it thicker did not increase its durability. We had to go to a different method of manufacture for the PTFE so that it could handle the abuse that I was going to go. But yeah, that was a learning experience where, like, oh yeah, no, it's falling apart. Let's just make it thicker and it should be fine. And that was not the way to go.
Oh, that's a terrific lessons learned. Thanks for sharing that one. Well, you also mentioned having become adept at developing disruptive technologies in the highly regulated industry of medical devices. Can you speak about one or two of these technologies that you have helped develop?
Yeah, sure. No, I'd be happy to. I have throughout my career, I've had the opportunity, the privilege to get a couple of patents underneath my name, originating from developing ideas that are unique to my industry. But in the worlds of disruptive technologies, for what I do, a good portion of my early career was in developing standard conventional catheters. These are basically small, flexible tubes that go into the body through the pathways that are already there, whether they be a vascular pathway, they'll go into a blood vessel, or maybe they'll go into an airway or some other pipe that's in the body, right? But over the years, we're developing more and more robotic control over those. So no longer are these just this flexible dummy straws that a physician might manipulate by hand on the back end, but now they have to be robotically controlled. And to do that requires mechanisms built into the catheter that can interface with robotic controls, servo motors, then of course gets translated into human interface controls so that the physician can drive to where they need to go. And all of this did not exist, not in the vascular space, 10, 12 years ago.
Well, speaking of catheters, can you talk a little bit about what are some of the development strategies that are unique to catheters as opposed to like laparoscopic devices or surgical instruments? Because they're very specific shapes and materials that are commonly used in catheters that aren't necessarily used in other kinds of medical device development.
That's very true. And one of the things that I find enjoyable to talk about is the complexity required for catheters. So we're always up against conflicting design requirements, as I'm sure every industry is. Physicians want the inside of the catheter to be as big as possible so that they can fit their instruments through it, but they also want the outside to be as small as possible so that they can navigate deep into the anatomy. So I'm still working on making the ID bigger than the OD. But one other aspect is the proximal end of the catheter. That's the end that the physician holds, or the end that attaches to the robot. It needs to be relatively stiff so that you can push on it. The distal end, or the far end, the end that is first inserted into a patient, it needs to be super floppy so you don't do any harm when you're trying to navigate these blood vessels or airways or natural pathways in the body. So having a single tube that goes from super floppy to super stiff is a very interesting design challenge. And that is one thing that differentiates it from the rigid robotics. The other thing, though, is rigid robotics are decently rigid. The Da Vinci robot, it does laparoscopy procedures. It makes a couple of little holes in your abdomen, and you have these basically rigid arms with end effectors that are very repeatable and controllable, and they get used many times. The catheters, however, they're made out of materials that are very susceptible to the environment that they're in. So when you're designing a catheter, you might be using polymers that get quite a bit softer when they're in a moist, warm environment than they would on the bench. So you have to make sure that whatever you're designing for, you have your specification sheets for how the material should behave on the bench, but you also have to consider that when it's in a patient, it's going to perform differently. So you got to make sure your tests are geared towards actual clinical relevance.
And how do you do that? Do you have a special test fixture or some kind of phantom, human temperature, body temperature bath that you place the catheters in?
We surely do. Yeah, sous vide is relatively new in the kitchen, but in the medical device industries, the water heaters have been around for quite a long time. So you'll have water baths, right? And your test fixtures will be submerged in the water baths that are brought up to temperature, a 35 C body temperature, so that you can observe how the device actually performs in a wet, warm environment.
It's funny that you bring up sous vide. We've used those as well. And I mean, you can, go out and spend thousands of dollars on some custom engineered solution to heat the water or the fluid solution up to temperature, or you go out and buy a $150 sous vide heater and stick that in there and it works great.
That's exactly right.
Yeah. Well, for engineers listening to this who are focused on developing new catheters, what's one skill or tool that you can recommend? The more specific, the better, to help those engineers succeed at developing new catheters.
I've got two answers for that. So I've got a very generic answer that I would recommend to every engineer out there. You really need to develop your own tools and your own references so that you can go back to it. So throughout the course of my career, through every project, I'm always calculating. In my particular industry, I'm always calculating the cross-sectional area of a catheter, or what happens if I take a tube that starts out at one size and I melt it down to a smaller annular shape, or maybe it's a smaller geometry altogether. I'm going to make that calculation again and again and again. So I've got an Excel spreadsheet where I continually add equations that I go back to all the time. Having your own references and your own tools that you know very well, I think, is vitally important for any engineer. And I would also highly recommend developing. You don't have to learn programming per se, but I really encourage engineers to learn a little bit about writing scripts or macros in Excel, or maybe a Python script, so that they can get rid of all of these rigorous tedious, repetitive calculations that we have to do, or tests that we have to do, or whatever it may be. But anything that you can automate it. It'll make your life a whole lot easier, and you can try a whole lot of different things faster, for sure. For catheters specifically, man, now that I think about it, it probably talks to any engineering discipline. You really got to know your materials. Like, you would be surprised at how frequently new materials hit the market, and they're not always super advertised. Sometimes you have to seek them out, but learning about how the materials perform, like going back to my PTFE example, right? I had to learn how PTFE was manufactured to see how it affected the final product. So learning how the materials behave, how they react, how they're formed, just know your materials and always keep eyes out for new materials.
Who are some of the material manufacturers out there, the suppliers that are commonly used in catheter manufacturing or development? I remember Zeus was a player back in the day. I haven't done much in catheters for quite a while. They may or may not still be there. But if I'm an engineer just getting started in catheters and I'm looking for a supplier that I can just order some sample tubing from, where would I go to look?
Yeah, no, I tell you what, the industry has significantly changed over the last probably 15 years. Zeus is certainly still out there. They are one of the major players in PTFE and fluoropolymers in general. There's other companies out there. There's Junkosha is a company based in Japan. They have a United States presence that are very capable in their fluoropolymers as well. Yet a lot of companies are developing these quick turn prototype things. So, for example, it's no secret, catheters have braid reinforcement frequently. They'll either have a coil or they'll have a braid reinforcement. Fort Wayne, Albrecht, they have these rapid accelerator programs where you can, get a relatively small quantity of a standard size and buy it quickly and try it. Same thing's true for extrusion houses. There's many different extrusion houses out there that offer, I know, it's not TE Connectivity. It was they were bought by Nordson. They have a website where you can just go in and pick out different extrusions that you may like. Spectrum Plastics has a shop stocking program for parts. I know Tegra and has mandrels that are readily ordered and hypotubes that you can order to build product with right off their dock. 3 or 4 days, you'll have some raw materials that might not be exactly what you think your design needs, but it'll get you in the ballpark.
That's great. That's great. I have 2 comments that are in reference to some things you had said earlier, and I just thought about them, and I thought, people might find these interesting or useful. So the first one, you were talking about how the PTFE wall thickness, and you wanted to make it more durable, so you made it thicker. Well, that didn't actually make it more durable. I had an experience, completely different material, but we a lesson learned that I had during an R&D phase. We had this part that was concave in shape, and we needed to chrome plate it, and so we sent it off to the chrome plater, and it came back. And I guess technically it was plated, but it didn't have that nice shiny chrome finish on it on the inside, the concave part. On the outside, it looked beautiful. Unfortunately, it was the inside that we really cared about. And so we wrote back to them and we're like, hey, what's going on here? The inside looks terrible. The outside looks great, but we don't care about the outside. And they told us, I can't remember the reason now, but for chrome plating, if you have a kind of a concave shape, that concave surface, the inside surface, isn't going to get as shiny unless they use some special process that they do have, but you have to specially request it. So that was something I never knew, and we got bit because we didn't know about it. But now I know if we want to chrome plate a concave shape, you have to request that particular method of doing so to get the concave surface nice and shiny. And then the other one was, you mentioned Excel spreadsheets, and I've done the exact same thing that you have over the years. I've built my own spreadsheet, mostly with mechanical equations like beam deflection and buckling and different cross-sectional shapes and things like that. And I mean, it's been tremendously useful. I've used it for 15 years now, right? And I keep adding to it. But the number of times I've pulled that out over the years is, if I had a nickel for every time, one of those things. So anyway, bit of a departure, but I wanted to share those 2 things as well. All right. Back to Joe. So your recent experience in the industry, like you've mentioned, has been in developing surgical robots. In fact, you currently work at Intuitive Surgical, the creator of the prestigious Da Vinci robot. Can you speak a little about surgical robots? I mean, what benefits have they brought to medical device or medical procedures, and what are some of the limitations still?
Oh yeah, no, that's a good question. As far as the benefits they had brought is the ability to give a physician extra fine control. So let me clarify something really quickly. So it is, in fact, the Da Vinci robot. Everybody calls it the Da Vinci robot, but it's not actually a robot in a conventional manner. We don't tell it, hey, go pull out that dude's appendix, right? It's always a physician driving it, right? So a physician is always in control, and it's the inputs from the physician are interpreted by the robot and then actuated on the patient. So it is in fact robotic controlled, but the robot's not doing that much by itself without a direct physician interference. With that being said, the advantages are the best example I can think of is your mouse sensitivity. So on many people's computers, they'll have mouse sensitivities adjusted to a certain amount where they'll move the mouse an inch, and then on the screen, it'll move all the way across the screen. Well, we're doing one of the capabilities of the Da Vinci robot is you can do exactly the opposite, wherein a physician can move 12 inches in real space with his hands as input, his or her hands as input, but inside of a patient, the distal end of the end effector might move only a millimeter. So if you have that kind of precision, that kind of control, you can be pretty precise about every little nook, cranny, cut, stitch, everything you're doing, every staple that you place, it can be very precisely controlled. So, and getting it right the first time, I think, is going to be a big step in I think legislation is going more and more that direction, wherein the hospitals and the physicians are responsible for doing it right the first time, where the patients pay for it the first time. However, if that patient has to come back and see that the exact same procedure again, the hospital may be liable for the cost of that.
Interesting. Huh. So what do the controls look like for the Da Vinci? Is it little knobs and buttons that you turn and push, or is it like some kind of joystick that you're moving around, or what do they look like?
Yeah, for the Da Vinci robot, they are in fact joysticks, but not in a conventional manner. They're three-dimensional joysticks that are they're like little pinchers that you can operate in space, and they're on these little non-interfering boom arms where a physician can move his or her arms and grab and pinch things with their own fingers, as if their fingers were the forceps inside a patient, or as if their fingers was pushing a suture through some intestines, right? So I'm proud to be part of the company, but I've only been with them for 5 years. But the name Intuitive Surgical is extremely appropriate because it allows a physician to just try and do the things with his or her own hands as if it was their own hands, right? It's very intuitive.
Well, that's very cool. I would love to try that. So it's almost an extension of the surgeon's hands, is what you're saying. Absolutely. Got it. Okay. Well, what do you think that there's a future where surgical robots are 100% autonomous, or do you think there's always going to be, some human interaction?
It's interesting. I work with data scientists and programmers and roboticists of very high caliber, and almost everyone will tell you that the AI is exceptionally equipped to handle things of a very predictable nature. However, every one of those engineers would tell you they would still want a pilot flying the plane if it ever needed it. However, there are definitely some lower risk things that could be completely handed off to automation to allow the robot to do itself. A great example is the self-driving cars, right? There's potentially some controversy there about how effective they are and whether or not we should implement that technology. But I don't think anyone's complaining about parking one of those cars. So parking is a relatively low risk feature, right? If retracting an instrument from a patient is a relatively low risk process in the whole surgical procedure. So maybe those aspects absolutely would be a physician pushes a button and the device does what it needs to do.
Got it. Okay, that's a good analogy. How about this? What advances in surgical robotics should we expect to see in the next, 4, 5, 7 years? And what skills do engineers need to have specifically to develop these advances?
I definitely do believe AI is going to become more and more on center stage, and with the robots having greater and greater processing power to analyze a certain situation, whether it's being precisely cutting a circular retina around a patient's eye during eye surgery, or they are precisely placing sutures in a captured intestine, for example. I'm sorry if that's a bit graphic, but these are things where the physician can line up for and then push a button to finish the job, right? To go make it happen. As far as skills that engineers need to develop to develop those advances, I got to go back to materials, because the devices that I make today use in many cases, they use different materials than what I had done when I first started making catheters, because the materials that I deal with today, they weren't available. And they offer so many advantageous properties and features that materials in the day did not have. So yeah, you always got to keep an eye on new materials.
Yeah. Well, I'm looking at you. The listeners won't be able to see the video here, but I'm seeing you right now. You're not that old, and already in your career, things have changed quite a bit, is what you're telling me. So that's fascinating.
Absolutely.
Yeah. All right. Well, I'll take a very short break here and share that teampipeline.us is where you can learn more about how we help medical device and other product engineering or manufacturing teams develop turnkey equipment, custom fixtures, and automated machines to characterize, inspect, assemble, manufacture, and perform verification testing on your devices. We're speaking with Joe Bogusky today. What are a few traits, Joe, that you have seen in the most successful engineers and in the most successful engineering teams?
I think it's really important to read outside of your industry. I personally am looking at parametric design, which is predominantly some methodologies that are used in architecture. Learning a lot of stuff there that I'm looking to employ in future designs. So yeah, I think individuals, when they want to be successful, they read a lot of diverse information. As far as teams, I think the teams work best when there's enough experience on the team, enough diverse experience on the team where they can all work together. I work great when I have someone who's very knowledgeable in different materials and someone who's very knowledgeable in different manufacturing processes. But I also really enjoy working with individuals that have done things in different ways than I have done. And if you can't find one of those people, just find somebody new, right? If you get somebody new who's at least somewhat verbally curious and asks questions, they always spark new conversations or try and they'll force people to see things in a way that I might not have looked at or might not have considered, because they're coming out with completely new eyes. So, and of course, that new individual has a benefit of hopefully learning something from more senior peers.
Right, absolutely. Going back to your comment about reading books, I also love to read books. I think they're one of the best and cheapest sources of new ideas. When you read a book, is it typically something specific that you have sought out? The root of my question is, where do you go to find your new ideas? Do you start with a very specific question and find a book that answers that question? Or do they kind of happen organically? And if the latter, what are these organic sources that are leading you to these books?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. So when I advocate reading a lot, it's actually not so much books that I'm advocating. I have the convenience that I live very near a university library, and so there's a lot of university papers that are there. And what I found is that with a couple of clever keywords, you'll find things that are very similar, but also a little bit different than what you're working on. So when I'm working on catheters, and a great example of this is while trying to figure out how to increase the torsional stiffness of a catheter. And what that means is that when a physician or a robot is trying to twist the back end of a catheter, the far end of the catheter that's inside the patient will actually twist when the patient twists. So you look up things like torsion and torque and tubular designs and braid reinforced designs, what have you. And there's a lot of papers there, no doubt, for sure. But one of the papers that captivated me and took me off into a wild tangent was, why are seahorse tails square? Most animals that have little grabby things, you think of snake. When you think catheters, it's very easy to think of worms and snakes and, octopus and, the elephant's trunk, they're mostly round, but a seahorse's tail is square. They have a square skeletal structure. And just reading about why that is, or what we've just learned about that, just kind of opens up some brand new ideas just that are crazy. So biomimicry is a great source of inspiration, and it's generally in places you don't expect it.
That is fascinating. Seahorse tails being square. Yeah. And going to a university to access those white papers, really great advice there. What are a few ways that you have seen individual contributors and engineering teams unknowingly sabotage their own success?
Yeah, it's losing sight of a bigger picture. So in my industry, it's a heavy regulated industry, and if we make mistakes, it could have very, very significant impacts. Hopefully they're just financial. It's, market launch dates get pushed back or something benign like that, but it could be even more significant than that. So testing things is very important, for sure. But I think if you get too focused on one particular aspect of your tests, you can spend a lot of time trying to figure out the perfect test that isn't necessarily going to give you the time where you can explore different ideas where maybe even that test isn't necessary, right? It's if you're trying to test how robust something is, for example, and then you spend a whole lot of time developing a test that tortures your device, that is time that is valuable. But if you spend too much time doing that, you might have missed this indestructible material that was over here that would make that test mostly moot. So getting too focused on any one particular detail, I think, is a good way to bring productivity to a halt.
It is tough for engineers, I think, because we love going down rabbit holes, right? We love understanding exactly why the seahorse's tail is square, and it can be easy to spend too much time there. Yeah. Well, all right. My next question here. This is the debut of this question, so I'm trying it out on you. A little bit of a guinea pig here. What is the most scared that you've ever been, and how did you handle the situation, and what did you learn from it?
Professionally?
You can choose whatever you feel like. Yeah, whatever you want to share.
Personally, by far. I was watching my brother's kid, and we were out playing in a park somewhere, and we played hide and seek. And he's really bad, right? Kids are really bad at hide and seek, usually. Yeah, you see where this is going. And I took my eyes off him for a minute, and sure enough, I did misplace him for a minute, and that was terrifying.
Oh, I can only imagine.
Yeah, I mean, and I did whatever uncle, I guess, would probably do, right? Of course, I have the biological reactions, the terror and the fear. I feel the heart, my heart beating out of my chest. But yeah, I do what you would normally do, just start calling for him and screaming for him, and looking around like crazy man.
And eventually, he popped his head out of some bush and.
Yes, yeah, of course.
Okay, thank goodness. Well, I'll share mine. Can't ask the question and then not share mine. So what this is also a personal experience that this is our second son, and when he was not quite a year old, we were out eating at a restaurant, and this totally has nothing to do with engineering, but that's okay. It's interesting anyway. Out to eat, and all of a sudden he started having a seizure. And this had never happened before, so we were like, oh no, what's happening? And then he started going blue, like he wasn't getting oxygen, and I was totally useless, right? I think I called 911, and that's about all I could do. I was completely useless otherwise. Luckily Grandpa was there, and he had the sense to stick his finger into our son's mouth and dig out something had lodged in his throat, and he was choking on it. Paramedics got there, and he had started to come back around, but he was still pretty lethargic. Anyway, what happened is he had what's called a febrile seizure, which apparently is not super uncommon for younger kids. And it's kind of like the body's way of restarting the computer, right? It happens when there's a sudden spike in core temperature. Apparently, he had pneumonia. We didn't know that, and that triggered this spike in temperature, which triggered the seizure. And unfortunately, he was eating something when that happened. So then he started choking on some chips or whatever he was eating. Anyway, like you said, right, the heart starts beating fast. That was terrifying. But luckily, he was totally fine. And then, all right, super quick, short tangent story after that. So they told us, the doctors, kids who have had febrile seizures, they might have another one. The risk for having one is greater, even though they're usually totally harmless. Just keep an eye out for it. So my wife and I were pretty, aware that this could happen, and we're keeping our eyes out. And I was working from home about a week later, and I hear my wife screaming. And I'm thinking to myself, oh no, it's happening again, right? Our kid's having another seizure. So I rush out of my office into the living room, and I'm saying, oh, what's going on? Is he okay? What's happening? And she says, there's a bird in the house. There's a bird in the house. And I'm thinking, are you kidding me? That's what you're yelling about, a bird? Oh, I was anyway. All right. Well, we're getting towards the end here. Just a couple more questions, and we'll wrap it up. What is the best compliment that someone at work ever gave you?
As weird as it may sound, I think it was a compliment regarding my use of analogies. So trying to communicate a relatively complex concept to somebody who wasn't an engineer, and pulling from my knowledge of the real world and what most normal people might have experience with, pulling analogies to try and explain what was going on in the system, using an analogy that this particular individual could relate to. So yeah.
That's huge, right? Being able to speak and communicate in a way that someone understands. Our engineering manager likes to say that the meaning of communication is the how does he say it? The answer that you get back. Basically, trying to say if the person you're speaking with doesn't understand what it is you're saying, then you're not communicating. So using analogies, I think that's a great way. And I've already seen your skill at that with the mouse analogy and the robot. So.
Yeah.
All right. Well, if you could write one thing on a billboard that every engineer in the world was going to see, what would your message be?
I would say, not only for engineering, but in life in general, just don't hold too firmly to things that you think you know. The world's always changing. Our comprehension of things is always expanding. And things that were true at one point, or we believe to be true at one point, it might not be exactly true today. So just keep your eye out for getting too locked into the things that you think you know, because it might not be true anymore.
I love that you shared that. I call this the absolute certainty principle, and I have talked with my team about being aware of the absolute certainty principle in the past. In fact, there's a quote on my wall here by Mark Twain. It says, "It ain't what you don't know that gets you into trouble. It's what you know for sure that just ain't so."
Oh, I like that. I like that.
Yeah.
Nice.
Very, very wise. Yeah. All right. Well, what's the best part of your job, Joe?
Oh yeah, that's well, you know what? That's kind of tricky for me. I'm very lucky wherein I really like my job. I really like having these crazy ideas and going to the lab and trying to see if I can actually make them. That's the maker part of me is coming out in the lab for sure. I really enjoy trying to teach other engineers things that I have experienced or things that I think I know, right? So I like sharing that sort of knowledge. And of course, in my particular industry, seeing the effects that my products have on people, man, that's I'm really lucky to be where I'm at. I really, really am. But
yeah, that's incredible. How can people get a hold of you? Maybe they're looking for some mentorship, or they have some questions for you. What's a good way for people to find you?
Sure. Probably the best way will be you can find me on LinkedIn. There's not too many Boguskys in the world, so I don't think you'll find too many on there, and certainly not that many in the medical device industry. So just search for me there.
Perfect. Wonderful. Well, Joe, this has been just delightful. Thank you so much for sharing some of your time and your wisdom and insight that you've gained through hard experience over what was it, 20, 25 years in the industry. Thank you very much.
Yeah. It's my pleasure. Thank you for having me and giving me the opportunity to potentially reach new future engineers.
I'm Aaron Monker, founder of Pipeline Design and Engineering. If you liked what you heard today, please share the episode. To learn how your team can leverage our team's expertise developing turnkey equipment, custom fixtures, and automated machines, and with product design, visit us at teampipeline.us. Thanks for listening.